maybe is some glimmer of hope. Starmer's just had the ambassador for the United States sacked because he was linked with Jeffrey Epstein. And the week before that, he had Angela Rayner resigning because she had been caught up in an expenses scandal. And these seem to come from nowhere in some way because we all knew about Mandelson for a long time. There's a lot of hope that maybe this is the end of Starmer. Anyway, look, to join us to talk about this is John Booth, who is a former colleague of Peter Mandelson's, but now he is his nemesis. And you know all the skeletons. John, I think a lot of people have been asking this question, which is why did Starmer appoint Mandelson for this position as an ambassador for the United States when we all knew that he had these links with Epstein? What's your view? He could have picked anyone. Why did he choose Mandelson?
Morning, Crispin. To answer your question, I think we need to recognize that Peter Mandelson, who headhunted me to be the party chief press officer way back in 1985, has been a center of a network for at least 40 years, of which Epstein is a part. It's an international network of support and encouragement. Mandelson has been part of it from, I think, his very early days growing up in North London, with a lot of Jewish population with an identification with Israel. He grew up with that, I think, and that's been an important part of his identity. He's enamored himself with America. He was one of the early members of the British American Project, which I've researched and written about for a long time, along with Jim Naughtie and Jeremy Paxman and various other people. So he's been part of the Anglo-American transatlantic scene with an Israeli dimension to it. The American end of the British American Project was chaired by Paul Wolfowitz, who was the author of the Iraq War. And this, I'll show you, was what Mandelson was saying to Labour MPs who challenged the Iraq War. So he and Starmer, who inherited, basically Starmer is a retread New Labour 2, essentially, but without the depth of political experience, which is why we see such floundering incompetence and terrible judgment. And I don't think he's long for number 10. And even if he stays there, he's not going to be an influence. So that network is powerful. Mandelson's become part of it. He's talked himself and persuaded a lot of gullible journalists over the years that he's brilliant and that therefore we should listen to what he says. He's a serious campaigner. And Starmer, I think, has swallowed that. He's part of the same North London circuit that Mandelson grew up in 30 years before. And I think Starmer is very much part of that network. He's linked in not just to the British state through his position as DPP, CPS, but he's also closely linked to the Americans. He was very closely involved in his role as a DPP with Holder, who was the Attorney General in the United States. So that link is very deep. And I think Starmer wanted somebody who he thought would continue to grease that relationship with the United States very well. And Mandelson is known as a smoocher in that kind of way. And so I don't think it takes much explaining. The problem is, I think, that Starmer is not a very shrewd operator. I remember his predecessor, Frank Dobson, an old friend of mine, who was not only a good politician, but he had a sense of humor. He made people laugh. He could get people involved in politics with some spark to him. And Starmer is just a block of wood, really. And whether his script is written by this man who is now involved with Labour Together and has done all of this stuff, apparently the vaccines thing, or whether other people are writing his script, he's basically just following the retread of New Labour 1. I think Blair is not far from the scene either with his Atlantic relationships. And that's what we're resulting in. And the problem for me, which I've began to see when I worked briefly for Mandelson, he headhunted me and then sacked me way back in 1986, is that he was already on a path to degrade the Labour Party and to degrade the moral and ethical content, which brings a lot of people into the Labour Party. And he's encouraged a lot of younger people. I mean, the people he encouraged, like Wes Streeting, the guy who's been on TV this morning, the Brighton MP, Peter Kyle, all of these younger people have been encouraged by Mandelson, believe the way you do politics is by lying and smearing and being sleazy, and cultivating people like Murdoch. And I mean, he cultivated the BBC because he was a friend of the Director General, John Birt. And you meet plenty of BBC journalists whose careers were threatened if Mandelson didn't like their stories by saying, remember, I know your boss. And anybody who's gone through difficult troubles in employment knows what kind of serious threat that is. And that's what he's done. The Guardian has given him a free run for 40 years. And so we're stuck in this awful situation where the Labour Party now has lost a lot of its members. A lot of its talented people have been removed. And we're now left with two people who are both Labour friends of Israel running as deputy leader. And it's an absolutely catastrophic situation. Paul Routledge of The Mirror, who wrote a very good piece on Friday, I saw him 10 days ago, and he wrote the unauthorized biography of Mandelson and said years ago that it would end in tears. And so it has. But what's also happened is that the party Mandelson proclaims he loves, the Labour Party, has been brought down by him at the same time. And people like Starmer are not of the stature to turn that kind of thing around.
So, just briefly, do you think Mandelson is the sort of main man of the new Labour Starmer vision of Labour? Is he, now that is that the end of him, or is he just not got a position and he's just going to be advising still?
Well, he's going to be there in the background, as is Tony Blair. They'll be there because they've been part of the network which continues, which is to do with the city, it's to do with Atlanticism, it's to do with Israel. And that network continues. And Mandelson has been part of all of those three networks. He's made a business out of this. I'll show you this, which I dug out. This man is one of the Rothschilds who funded Mandelson's early effort called Policy Network. He gave him $250,000. Mandelson's been part of that network for a very long time. And that will continue. I mean, he's a figure who obviously has lost enormous credibility. And it was embarrassing to see Starmer at PMQs wriggling and worming his way. And we now know, as a result of continuing revelations from Bloomberg and from the Telegraph and the Mirror and various places, that Starmer was lying. He knew a lot about what Mandelson had been up to with the Epstein network. I mean, I didn't know this when I was headhunted for the Labour Party, that Mandelson, this was 40 years ago, already knew Robert Maxwell. He was very closely linked to the Maxwell family 40 years ago. I remember going, and my job as chief press officer at the party was to improve relations with the Mirror, whose chief political person at the time was Joe Haynes, who had been Harold Wilson's PR man. And I went in one evening after work to have a drink with Joe, and he was fuming. He said, "Who is this guy Mandelson? He's going over my head directly to Bob." The people at the Mirror called Maxwell Bob in this rather pathetic way. They all called him Bob as though he was their best mate. He's gone over my head to Maxwell. And that was 40 years ago. So He was part of that network then. and knew Ghislaine and knew that network, and then he became part of it all through Epstein. And of course, Mandelson was close to Prince Andrew because Prince Andrew had a brief for trade. So all of that linked in, and that won't go away. I mean, Trump may be embarrassed about it. The most positive encouragement on the American side of things is there are serious questions being asked in oversight about Trump and about Epstein's relations. And it's part of a serious inquiry in the United States by Republicans, Tucker Carlson and Republican senators who are asking all kinds of questions about American relationships with Israel, and in particular on the anniversary of 9/11, about what actually happened on 9/11. And there's an oversight inquiry going on in the United States to try to get to the bottom of all of that. And that will produce all kinds of interesting answers. I've been digging into 9/11 related stuff for over 20 years. And there's a lot that people don't know about what happened.
Well, we can talk about that another
We
time.
can.
I'm just thinking about the a visit of Trump, because all that's happened in the past week and the week before was there's so much going on, and then to think that Trump is coming here on Wednesday, what do you anticipate happening there? I mean, is Starmer going to be asked questions about Epstein and Trump? I mean, this Trump's all in there as well. I mean, I don't get what is a terrible time for Starmer, isn't it? Is Starmer going to last till the end of the week?
Well, I think what will happen, it's no accident that Trump's been shifted to Windsor Castle. And I think King Charles and Queen Camilla, as she calls herself, will earn their money big time. It will be shuffled on to become a royal type visit. And I think that we will see very little of Starmer, just as the way have we seen Starmer talk about the Mandelson thing since he left? The last we've seen of him is to do with PMQs. He's disappeared, and he'll keep away from this, and he'll ask Prince Charles to cover for him. And there'll be all the flummery, and Trump is a vain man. He will love all of that kind of attention from the king. And I think that's the way it will go. Starmer will keep himself out of it as possible. People like Clive Lewis, my friend Brian Leishman, a Scottish MP who I worked for at the last election, and others are asking serious questions about the future of Starmer, because it's so obvious to many people in the PLP. I live in Scotland, so I only hear it at second and third hand, but they're obviously not impressed with what Starmer is doing as a prime minister. And I think he'll just basically keep out of the limelight as much as he possibly can and let Charles Beckett.
Can I just sort of like I just to sort of finish this? I was at a football match yesterday. Fulham is my team. During the game, the fans were singing Keir Starmer's an expletive.
Yeah.
And I've never heard that in a football game at Fulham before. And I'm just wondering also, these stories, the Angela Rayner one seem to come from nowhere and then become massive in a couple of days. The Mandelson one, we all knew that there was a link with Epstein, and then they kind of just had a few extra bits to it. I'm wondering, are the media and the political establishment after Starmer? It just seems like there's a lot of intense scrutiny on him now that there wasn't for all this time before. Do you think there's some agenda going on in any way?
Well, I think eventually even the Westminster lobby have to catch up with reality. On the Trevor Phillips show was the man who libeled me in his hagiography of Mandelson. He was described as Mandelson's biographer. Trevor Phillips, who obviously is a friend of Mandelson, Mandelson was his best man the first time round, didn't say that the guy who was sitting on his panel had had his biography pulped as a result of my libel action. But even that man, who was sucking up to Mandelson so much that he wrote a book that had to be pulped praising him, had to admit that Starmer was in difficulty. And I think people are catching on. And the difference, of course, with 20, 40 years ago is social media. People can access through your programs and others information which 40 years ago they couldn't. And so they're not going to be fooled by these people sitting in the Westminster lobby. The older ones are too lazy to do a job, and the younger ones are wanting to make sure they have a future. Mandelson is not the passport to their future that they thought he was 20, 30 years ago and had to suck up to him in order to have a career. That is over, absolutely over. And I think Starmer is going to, he's never been popular. He doesn't have an attractive personality. He doesn't have Frank Dobson's sense of humor or communication. He hasn't got much going for him apart from the powerful forces that brought him there in the first place. And they, in turn, are under pressure. I don't think it's going to happen overnight, but his position is eroding and eroding quite rapidly. The only thing that he's got going for him is the Labour Party's been so denuded of talent that there aren't any obvious people to replace him. Look at the two people who are deputy leader. You know, you couldn't imagine people with less to say about anything, both Labour friends of Israel. So he relies on the fact that there's no competition, but all of that is happening. Real people who are committed to political change aren't part of the Labour process. My friend Brian Leishman has been suspended by the PLP for some minor infraction, allegedly. He's not been allowed to vote on the deputy leader thing or make nominations. He was only elected last year. He's a very hardworking guy. He's lost his main employer, which was the Grangemouth refinery. He's not allowed to take part in this process. This is not sustainable. And people who come on your program and the people who support it and other alternatives, they're energetic. And we haven't had much of that on the left for a very long time. We've had people saying nice things, but not being prepared to take the hard decisions. And we're left in the mess that we're in. But I think that now is changing in a very positive way. It will probably not happen much in my lifetime, but it's happening. And we must do all we can to be positive and encourage it.